Okay, I think we have at least half of our registered attendees online, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in North America. Welcome to the Guidelines International Network North American webinar series. My name is Yarada Abrahamian. I am the outgoing chair of GIN North America. After a bit of a COVID-induced break, our webinar series is back. And we are actively working on developing a schedule and a list of speakers and webinars that we think would be of great value to you. Today's topic, race and racism considerations for clinical practice guideline development, is of utmost relevance to our community at this critical juncture in North American medicine and healthcare. It is absolutely urgent that our guideline community addresses the problem of race and racism in our work, works to ameliorate the problem, as well as prevent it from holding any space in our work, in our guideline development work. Our esteemed panelists today are at the forefront of this work, and we are ever so grateful to them that they have dedicated their time to share their knowledge, expertise, and research in this arena. This is the first installment in a series on this topic. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'd like to share some highlights about GIN North America. Sorry, my slide's not advancing. There we go. So GIN North America is a regional community of Guidelines International Network. It's been so since 2010. We were the first regional community of GIN. Our membership consists of guideline developers, adapters, implementers, as well as systematic reviewers and researchers from Canada, Mexico, and the US. Our members represent medical specialty societies, insurance companies, payers, academic institutions, as well as other such entities in the field of healthcare. If you are not a member of GIN, we urge you to join GIN and create an account on GIN Connect, which is the networking platform GIN hosts and uses for communication. This webinar will be recorded and available on the GIN YouTube page in a few days. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact GIN North America. Our email is listed in the slides. This is one of the our hallmark features of GIN North America, the webinar series, and we'd like you to return to them on a regular basis. We also host in-person meetings as well as mini conferences. And we welcome all attendees, all GIN member attendees. So thank you for joining us today. Before I move on to introducing our speakers, I'd like to go over some house rules. You are muted upon entry. Please remain so. Throughout the webinar, if you have any technical issues, please send a note to me or Gina Baptiste, who is also a member of the GIN North America webinar series, GIN North America steering group. And during the talk, please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit your questions for our speakers. At the end of the webinar, we will allot 30 minutes for Q&A, and we will, Dina and I will share your questions with our speakers. So now on to the introduction of our speakers. It is virtually impossible to capture the prolific work of our speakers today. But what you're seeing on the screen is a synopsis of their roles. Dr. Issa Davis is the Associate Professor of Medicine and Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where she's also the Medical Director of their Tobacco Treatment Service. She's also the Director of SEED, and last but not least, she's a member of the United States Preventive Services Task Force and has been so since January of 2021. Dr. Jennifer Lin is Director of the Kaiser Permanente Evidence-Based Practice Center, and she's a Senior Investigator at the Center for Healthcare Research at Kaiser Permanente Northwest, and she's a Professor of Health System Sciences at the KP School of Medicine. Dr. Shazia Sadiq is Assistant Professor of Medicine at the Division of Gastroenterology at UPenn, where she's also the Associate Director for Research at their Center for Evidence-Based Practice. She's also a Senior Fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute for Health Economics and a member of the Clinical Guidelines Committee at the American Gastroenterological Association. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lin to get us started.
Great, thank you, Yurato. And first, I just want to thank Yurato and Dina and also Jen for making space, a series on this important topic. And just to let you know, I'm very excited to be here with my esteemed colleagues and friends. So as Yurato mentioned, this is the first part of a series. So I think you can think of today as maybe a primer for this topic. First, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the background on health equity with an explicit focus on race and racism. Then my colleagues, Dr. Davis and Dr. Siddiq, will talk about the challenges from the clinical practice guideline perspective and their work, working with their respective guideline groups. And hopefully we'll finish the presentation with some concrete things that folks can do now within your own organizations. And then we hope to have ample time for a Q&A and really to hear from you all what your organizations are doing in this sphere and how to further the conversation and the work in this area. So next slide. So to set up the context of addressing race and racism, I'm going to touch on some background information from our work that we did in support of the U.S. Preventive Service Task Force that we completed last year. I would like to first just acknowledge my amazing team for this work, the experts and the task force members, including Dr. Davis, and our colleagues at ARC for their contributions. And for your reference later, I've included a link to our full report if folks want to use that as a reference document in the future. So next slide. So our report, we had two main tasks. The first was to articulate the definitional and conceptual issues around racism and health inequities, and then second, to describe how racism and health inequities are currently being addressed in preventative health, as our client was U.S. Preventive Service Task Force. But today, I'm really going to focus on a high-level summary of AIM 1, which are key terms and concepts that are critical to addressing racism and guidelines, and talk a little bit about how racism produces health inequities. And given my time, I will say in advance, I'm not going to be able to do justice to really any of these topics, but hopefully it will whet your appetite or refresh your memory. Great. So a few notes about race and ethnicity as categorization systems and sort of preferred terminology. So first, I think it's incredibly important to be explicit that our concept of race emerged from and in support of European colonialism, oppression, and exploitation. So at the time, racial ideology was developed to divide and rank people of European, Native American, and African descent by ascribing observable and physical differences and similarities. I think most of us, if we're old enough, remember the terms Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, and that's precisely where they came from. After the abolishment of slavery in the 19th century, racial ideology really evolved quite significantly in the US and to some extent in Canada, but much more in the US, to suppress the social, economic, and political advancement of historically oppressed people. Most specifically Black Americans, but also other people of color as well. Currently in the US, there are only 5 officially recognized categories of race that are used. And so therefore, this is what we see in our health research. And those are white, Black, Native American, or Alaskan Native grouped as 1, Asian, Native, Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander grouped as 1. So even though ethnicity and race as terms are somewhat conflated and used interchangeably, ethnicity really refers to a collection of people who share a common ancestry, history, or culture. Ethnicity is a broader social category than race, and it encompasses a wide range of learned cultural characteristics, including language, religion, traditions, diet, values, norms, etc. Because ethnicity includes a variety of cultural and ancestral characteristics, people can identify as more than one group. For example, I identify as Chinese American, can be Black Caribbean, Cuban American, Italian Jewish. But currently in the US, there's only 2 ethnic categories recognized and defined by the OMB, and that's people of Hispanic or Latino origin and people not of Hispanic or Latino origin. So as you can imagine, it's quite limited. Just a quick note about preferred terminology. I think the main thing to understand is the preferred terminology has evolved over time. It continues to evolve, and the best guidance that's out there, put out by many different groups, sometimes conflicts. So I think the most important thing to focus on is when you're using terms, be specific. For example, try to avoid terms like non-white or other, or don't say diverse if you mean people of a certain heritage. I think it's always also important to err on the side of being inclusive and respectful and person-centered. And so just acknowledge the fact that this may require asking the groups for whom you're referring to how they would like to be referred to. All right, next slide. So racism, so I think most of us think we know what racism is, but I think it's important to be explicit and specific here. So I'm going to spend a little time on this slide. First, there's a need to understand that racism is different from prejudice. So prejudice is a hostile or dismissive attitude, a feeling towards people that we find different from ourselves in some way. And racism is much more than that. It's a whole set of beliefs and therefore practices that are based on these feelings with the explicit purpose of oppressing and subjugating specific people. So racism is really predicated on having the power to oppress. So today, when we talk about racism, we mean the totality of mechanisms by which racial inequality are perpetuated. And this is most commonly referred to as structural or systemic racism. In the past, mainstream society and medicine has had a fairly narrow understanding of racism, and it was really limited to this concept of interpersonal racism, which is focused on discrimination. So discrimination is having differential actions towards individuals based on prejudice. But I think it's important to understand that there are much larger and more sinister aspects of racism than just interpersonal racism. So structural racism, I think an important characteristic of structural racism is that it does not require the actions or intent of racially prejudiced individuals to exist. It is a system that has been set up based on sort of the white patriarchy, and it will continue unless changed, even if the proportion of people in our society are less prejudiced. Institutional racism is a term that specifically refers to the individual processes of racism that have been embedded in our local, state, and federal policies, and the practices within our institutions. Modern examples of institutional racism, which I think many people are familiar with, are, for example, the privatization and relocation of hospitals, suspensions and expulsions in school, and criminal convictions and sentencing. I also list, just for completeness here, concepts of cultural racism and internalized racism, which I'm not going to really spend much more time on, but I do want to acknowledge that cultural racism really operates within and through structural and institutional racism. But it's, it really is a more inconspicuous form of racism and is one of the major levers for the implicit bias that we all have, especially if we've grown up in North America and again, specifically in the United States. So next slide. And I hope, probably that's a larger discussion, and maybe we'll have time to revisit if there's questions or discussion on sort of those concepts. But racism, as I alluded to before, just given sort of how we thought of racism in the past, or how the mainstream America thought of racism in the past, medicine is somewhat parallel in the fact that the most studied and well-documented aspect of racism in medicine is on discrimination. Again, and here on the slide it says equally or more harmful, but I would argue even more harmful than sort of discrimination are really the impacts of structural racism and institutional racism in healthcare. One of the largest drivers of inequities that we see is mediated through residential segregation, which effects go way beyond just the access to quality healthcare. And another example, most of you are familiar with the recent conversation around race-aware or race-conscious clinical prediction models. And this has really highlighted that medicine, as we previously thought, is really not as objective or apolitical as we previously thought. So next slide. So I just want to offer a few more comments around terminology so that we're all on the same page. Equality versus equity. I think most people are familiar with this concept or some version of the illustration that's on the slide, but I think it's critical for us to focus on equity here rather than equality, as equality in healthcare does not produce equal health outcomes because of racism and disadvantage through other social risk factors. And that's really important to understand. And although in the US, the terms health disparity and health inequities are often used interchangeably, disparities, to be clear, health disparities simply refers to the differences in health outcomes that we see across populations. But inequities are these differences that are due to injustice. And there are many circulating definitions of health inequity, but they really all converge on a few core concepts. And that is, one, health equity is a fundamental human right, that differences in health are avoidable and remediable, that differences in health are generally grouped around social, economic, demographic, and geographic risk factors. And their differences in health that we observe are, of course, clinically meaningful. And finally, social determinants of health, which I prefer to call social drivers of health. These refer to the conditions in the environment in which people are born, live, work, and age in that affect our health, both our functioning, our quality of life, as well as our health outcomes. Race and ethnicity, including immigration status, including racism, and its downstream consequences, are commonly included as social drivers in these categorizations of social drivers of health. And it's the uneven distribution of these drivers which results in health inequities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mechanisms by which social risk factors and racism affect health. So here I highlight just a few. Racism can affect health through reducing access to employment, housing, quality healthcare, as we've mentioned, for education. It can also increase exposure to other social risk factors, for example, through work or environment which folks live in, through adverse cognitive, psychological, and emotional effects. This has been very well studied. The diminished participation in healthy behaviors or increased engagement in unhealthy behaviors, either directly or indirectly resulting from stressors due to racism or racially targeted marketing in many instances. And I think really important to note is this notion of allostatic load. So that is the cumulative wear and tear on our physiologic systems and organs due to adversity or stress. And in addition to that, our neurobiological response to chronic stressors. And this is an area that's increasingly more well studied and understood. A lot of it has come from our understanding of trauma and adverse childhood experiences and sort of the sequelae on health that's long lasting. And it continues to be an active area of research. And I mention this and highlight this one because I think it's important to understand that while race does not have biological underpinnings in a categorization system, it is important to realize that through racism, there are biological differences according to race. And I think that sometimes these two notions are conflated, and it's easy, although not acceptable, for people to think that there are biological underpinnings to race. All right, next slide. I want to just finish up by highlighting two useful explanatory frameworks that can be used to really understand and dissect out what are the factors and moderators and root causes for inequities that can really be helpful in planning research, developing, review and guideline protocols, and really as we begin to change the way we do guidelines. This is one that is maybe familiar to many. It's from the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and it focuses on social drivers, including racism, and how they exert their effect on health and well-being. However, there's a number of frameworks that are more singularly focused on race and racism, and I want to, next slide, I want to just show one here that I like. This is a comprehensive framework by Dr. David Williams and his colleagues, and it articulates the multiple pathways by which racism can affect health, recognizing that racism is one of several fundamental determinants of health. And it's quite structurally similar to the social determinants of framework from the WHO, but it really provides much more specific detail to the effects of racism. And I think it also emphasizes really the importance of these basic causes from the surface and intervening causes. And this really highlights, in my mind, the fact that when we develop or when we do interventions aimed at changing some of these intervening rather than the fundamental or basic causes, while it might be helpful, it's unlikely to produce sort of long-term, long-lasting improvements in population health, and really imperative to address some of these basic causes. So I'm going to get off my soapbox and turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much, Jen. So I am going to, over my next couple slides, outline and present to you what we are doing on the United States Preventative Services Task Force with regards to addressing racism and health equity. So, the USPTF has always been committed to providing preventive services recommendations that apply to all of the population. And so we are committed to helping reverse the negative impacts of systemic racism on health, because we understand that while we are attempting to provide guidelines that affect all, we realize that oftentimes groups are not well represented in the evidence. And so we, prior to our work on racism, had published a paper on how best to ensure race is considered appropriately through our recommendation guideline process, and have always had this focus, but realized particularly over the past couple years with the events that have been occurring, that we needed to move from this focus on just race to focus on the effects of racism. And so we recognize that health inequities are due to, as Jen said, social, economic, and structural factors. And we are working to develop strategies to mitigate the influence of systemic racism in our recommendations. Next slide. So we published our kind of our initial 6-point action steps, if you will. And what they consist of is first, again, considering race as a social and not a biological construct. Promoting racial and ethnic diversity in our membership and within the leadership, and certainly working to foster a culture of inclusivity within our task force. We commissioned a report, as Jen alluded to help us understand systemic racism and how it undermines the benefits of our evidence-based clinical practice services or preventive services. We also have been working to update our methods to help us to overcome inequities that are experienced by populations affected by systemic racism. And we have been working on ways to communicate, better communicate gaps that are created by systemic racism and all of our dissemination efforts throughout our recommendation process. And then certainly we have always collaborated with partners and experts, but working to establish partnerships, particularly in the DEI space, to help us think about our guidelines and reduce the influence of systemic racism on health. So next slide. So what we've done additionally is we created a task force work group, which I chair, on race, racism, and health equity in clinical preventive services. We have also published our values and action statement that was published in JAMA. And in this publication, we outlined our critical first steps that we have been taking to create this change on how we recognize and address systemic racism around our clinical preventive services. And then, of course, the report that Jen just alluded to, we commissioned a report that would help us really understand racism and how it affects health, but then also understanding and learning from other guidelines that are out there how racism or the approach to mitigate racism is being addressed. So next slide. And so this is the report that she had mentioned earlier, and we'll provide a reference for you. Next slide. And so just in my last two slides, want to just give you a sense of where in our process we are making some additional changes and considerations. So just in our overall approach, we have been thinking about where we can be more effective in addressing health and equity and through our evidence review to identify our frameworks and strategies. We've performed an environmental scan of guideline making bodies and interviewed our key stakeholders to get their input on where we should focus on our efforts. Again, moving beyond race as a proxy for racism and considering directly racism as it impacts our clinical preventive services. We've been working with Jen and the EPC to develop and integrate a health equity framework that can be used at all stages of our recommendation process to help us really identify where health and equity could occur and how we would address them at each of those steps. Again, we've been ensuring that among our expertise that we continue to promote our diversity and our leadership among our membership, and also just building expertise in health disparities that will impact our deliberations of clinical preventive services evidence. And then informing our evidence reviews, we are routinely including methods to identify evidence that disproportionately affect populations or variation in effectiveness of preventive services. we're identifying systemic racism as a causal factor for variations in our prevalence and outcomes. We've been thinking about and including contextual questions in our evidence-based interventions to reduce inequities that are caused by systemic racism within specific recommendation statements, and have been pilot testing these in some of our upcoming recommendations. And we've been identifying the types of studies that are needed to address systemic racism. Next slide. At the interpreting of our evidence stage, we continue to think about and identify the types of outcomes that are needed to address racism. And we are considering the applicability, extrapolation, modeling in our individual patient data, our meta-analyses, and other methods to really understand and highlight where our gaps in evidence lie. And then with regards to communicating our evidence gaps, we have always in our guidelines highlighted gaps related to race and racism, but we are piloting procedures and that will allow us to do this better and kind of highlight more where these evidence gaps really exist, calling out for additional research on addressing systemic racism where we're able. We're also seeking to work more with our partner, the Community Preventive Services Task Force, mostly because they do more around the implementation strategies of guidelines, and really working with them because we understand that a lot of the inequities that occur related to our recommendations occur at that implementation stage. And so kind of working with them to see how we can continue to mitigate the health inequities that can occur. We've been seeking partnerships, again, with guidelining making bodies to address the diagnostic treatment, public health factors that contribute to health inequities. And we've been working on a inclusive language guide that will help us to develop more clear communication around our recommendations and our dissemination of our recommendations to better have inclusive terminology, as Jen mentioned, and certainly help to communicate better, understanding our interventions to reduce health inequities caused by systemic racism. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you so much. As Dr. Davis and Dr. Lin both very nicely outlined, there are a lot of challenges for those of us who are writing clinical practice guidelines because of how deep-rooted structural racism is, including in the evidence base as well. And as we always say, a guideline and our systematic reviews are limited by the underlying evidence base. And so for those of us who work as guideline developers, the interpretation of evidence really requires a critical eye toward many of these issues, including in the studies that we're looking at. Is race being used as a proxy for another variable? Almost always it is, because oftentimes it's just being assumed that it is a biological construct. And what is the proxy in that case? Is there limited generalizability of the evidence to diverse racial and ethnic groups? How does the intervention that we're studying actually affect secondary outcomes such as cost, resource utilization, access, all of which go on to impact equity? And how can we take our risk of bias assessment and adapt or modify it to account for equity considerations in all of these areas we've been talking about? And then as we start to craft our clinical guideline recommendations, how do we think about the differential effects that these recommendations may have amongst marginalized groups? And that then leads to, are there unique implementation considerations for our recommendations that account for heterogeneity in populations? Next slide. So I want to share a case example from gastroenterology. I'm a practicing clinical gastroenterologist, and I know that there are so many people on this call who are from specialty societies, and I wanted to use this as an example to show some first steps that perhaps could be done in your areas as well. So we conducted a systematic review of GI guidelines over the past decade for 4 different GI societies. And what we were looking for were race-based recommendations, essentially where our current guidance, so we excluded anything that was redacted or revised, but where our current guidance is telling people to treat or manage patients differently based on their racial or ethnic group. And as we've discussed, this is often assuming that race is a biologic construct, but this is really problematic because, as we all know, we rarely even ask patients what racial or ethnic group they self-identify with. Even if we do, that's problematic because these racial and ethnic groups are so heterogeneous. And we're literally making decisions based on people's skin color. So we ended up finding 8 different recommendations in 4 different topic areas. The first was surveillance for hepatocellular carcinoma, which is liver cancer in people with chronic hepatitis B. The second was surveillance for gastric intestinal metaplasia, which is a pre-malignant lesion for stomach cancer. The third was screening for Helicobacter pylori, which is an infection that lives in the stomach, also part of the causal pathway for stomach cancer. And the fourth was surveillance for Barrett's esophagus, which is also a precancerous lesion for esophageal adenocarcinoma. And one of the biggest challenges when we were doing this review and then writing the commentary was that we were really trying to figure out, what is race being used as a proxy for? Is it for understanding the effects of systemic racism? And if there are areas in which, you're allocating resources to really tackle the effects of systemic racism, that should be made explicit, and in some cases can be defensible. But oftentimes, as we've discussed, people are treating and perpetuating the concept that race is a biological construct. And so we don't have time to talk about all 4 of these, but I did want to highlight the first one, which is surveillance for liver cancer in patients with hepatitis B. The problem here is that current guidance, like we do this every single day in our clinics, we treat people differently because our guidelines say that Asian people and Black people should be surveyed or screened for liver cancer if they have hepatitis B completely differently. And this is relatively intensive testing. And that is historically because there were higher episodes and higher prevalence in certain countries. And it's not all Asian countries. It was specifically, previously to East Asia and certain sub-Saharan African countries. But again, these racial and ethnic groups lump people all together. And so when we ask people, okay, let's give you a scenario. If you had a patient coming into your clinic, a white patient who's a medical resident who had a needle stick exposure to hepatitis B versus an Asian patient versus a Black patient, are you really going to survey them differently, screen them differently for liver cancer? And some people said, yeah, we do that, but that doesn't make any sense because they have no inherent difference in their biologic risk because the virus level and their exposures are completely the same. So there's no inherent biologic reason that we should be treating them differently. And when we talked to the experts, they said, no, of course we don't treat them differently. Like they were exposed in the exact same way. They all got the same needle stick exposure. And so that really, this paper actually really highlighted to people that race is being used in an imprecise way to really think about what is the viral load in your bloodstream. And just because historically that was in certain populations and people who immigrated to the United States, that is not actually the correct variable. And so I'm really excited to share that the Liver Society is in the process of revising this recommendation and removing it as a race-based recommendation as a result of this paper. Next slide. So what are some other things we're doing through the American Gastroenterological Association? Like the USPSTF, we also are in the process of an ongoing effort to consider DEI principles throughout our entire guideline process in terms of how are we selecting guideline topics, for example, prioritizing topics that have race-based recommendations that really need to be revisited, promoting diversity amongst our guideline panel members. Of course, this needs to be done broadly as well in the entire membership. How do we create our protocol right up front when we're choosing our PCOTs, which, as many of you know, patient intervention comparator outcomes, timing, and setting, are outcomes itself. If we're not searching based on equity, we really can't write about that effectively if we haven't pulled studies that are, looking at that outcome. Thinking about critical appraisal with an equity lens. How do we incorporate equity into our evidence to decision framework, making sure we're doing that consistently, and then making sure that every single one of our guidelines has a section on implementation and equity consideration. So we're being really thoughtful about how our recommendations can be implemented and the effect on health equity. Next slide. So to summarize all of this, all 3 of us have talked about all of these issues, some early stages of work we're doing, and I know for all of you sitting there, you're really trying to think, okay, well, what can we do now as guideline developers? And I really want to go back to Dr. Lin's point about what is racism. And really, it requires people in a position of power to oppress another group of people. And as guideline developers, you are in a position of power and you have power to tackle structural racism through your recommendations. And the other reality is that you also have the unfortunate ability to unintentionally perpetuate or exacerbate existing inequities that stem from structural racism. And so there's so much that we can do, and that it really makes it very important for us to be intentional in how we're crafting our guideline recommendations. The second thing, as we talked about, is identifying race-based clinical guideline recommendations. As I showed you, we did that in the GI world. I will tell you the number of people that told me, yeah, racism exists, but not in our guidelines. We don't do that. We don't, like the GI community, we're not, in perpetuating this. And until it's really called out and shown that this is how we do it, and this is what we're doing every day, and this is why, maybe guidelines with certain intentions ended up getting, misused and really perpetuating disparities, we really can't tackle the problem. So just identifying them, reassessing them. And then as we're starting to onboard clinical guideline panel members, considering implicit bias training for them so that they can understand how their own perceptions may impact in the crafting of recommendations, promoting racial and ethnic diversity in membership and leadership. This is something that Dr. Davis talked about at the USPSTF. Advancing equity through intentional use of language. Also was mentioned in the past. Currently, we're using the AAMC Equity Guide to have some standardization of some of these terms that we're using, and then explicitly stating and beginning to understand mechanisms of how racism is causing observed health disparities. Next slide. So we have a lot of ongoing work on race and racism in clinical practice guidelines. All three of us are working in this area in many collaborative fashions, including evaluating algorithmic bias and fairness in race-aware and non-race-aware clinical prediction models, health equity frameworks for our evidence-based practice guidelines that go all the way from topic generation to dissemination and implementation. And so we're really looking forward to talking to you about some of this ongoing work, upcoming things in a second webinar as part of this series. And we wanted to end with an open-ended question just to hear about what your organizations are doing, some of the problems and challenges that you all have faced, and would love to hear your ideas as we transition into the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, so much, Drs. Lynn, Davis, and Sadiq, for really so thoroughly and comprehensively presenting such a complex and nuanced problem for us to, and sort of identifying the fundamentals we all have to accept in order to proceed to resolving the problem. So really, we appreciate your expertise and time. We look forward to more from you in the future. I think before we get to some of the questions submitted, I think it would help us to revisit some of the content Dr. Lynn shared about the true definitions. And Dr. Davis, I know you also have shared some thoughts on this. Please feel free to participate. I think it would help us again to revisit the distinction between racism, bias, and discrimination, and how they're sometimes confused. I think that would be a great way to start our Q&A. Dr.
Sure.
Davis, I see your head shaking. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Let's start with bias and kind of build our way up. So bias or prejudice, as Dr. Lynn stated, is when you have kind of this preconceived opinion or thought about something or somebody. And bias can be favorable or unfavorable, and usually is generated by your upbringing, your experiences, right? How you've been socialized. And you can think of it as a preference, right? A preference for one thing versus another. Discrimination is when you are unfairly or differentially treating a person or a group based off of their characteristics, so race, gender, age, sexual orientation. And it doesn't necessarily imply that you have power to oppress them, but you can just unfairly treat them. So denying them, making something, as if you own a store and you deny them, making a cake for them based off of their, sexual orientation, that would be discriminating. Racism is really, and I think the key with racism is the power piece of racism, right? And it's based off of understanding the racial differences that Dr. Lin described. So because of race, having these human traits and capacities that suggest one group is more superior than the other based off of those traits and capacities, right? Because of that, racism now is this kind of systemic where you use policies or systems or force to oppress another racial group based on the idea that that group is inferior, and then deny that group of the social, economic, and political advantage to that of another group that is deemed more superior. And so you see that in racial segregation of housing, right? So zoning a housing area, zoning areas to live based off of race. So one group can't live in another neighborhood because the policies prevent that from happening. Or people are denied loans to get businesses based off of their race, or entrance to education, right? So systematically keeping a group out based off this idea that they are inherently inferior. So racism really implies this kind of power to be able to do that. But I'll stop there. Dr. Lin, you have your.
You're muted, Jen.
You would think almost 3 years into this, I would get the hang of it. Yeah, Issa's far more eloquent than I could have said. I just want to make a couple follow-up points. I think one is this acknowledgement that we all have biases and prejudices, and particularly the operationalization of implicit bias in all of us. If folks haven't already done, most academic institutions, have required now, implicit bias training. But if you haven't already done implicit bias training, that might be also one of these things you can do now. I think it's, first and foremost, to recognize what our own operating principles and biases are. I think that's really critical. I think the other thing that I just want to emphasize, and I briefly mentioned it as I was going through the background matter, was that racism, because of the history of race and racism in our country, racism will continue to exist unless we change it, even if people of good intention and who are not so-called racist or as prejudiced, or who don't personally have discriminating type behaviors, even if those individuals no longer exist. So I think it's really important to understand that racism is baked in to a system that unless we change it, it will not change by itself. And it doesn't require evil individuals, to exist for it to self-perpetuate. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, there is a question that is a great segue into your comment, Dr. Lin, and that is, do you have any recommendations, any of the speakers for existing implicit bias training programs that would be helpful for guideline developers and panel members?
I am our colleagues who did work for the task force at Apt Associates have some collection of trainings that can be done, and I will ask them if we can just share it with this larger group. I know Kaiser, where I work, has a great implicit bias training program. And I can ask them if that's something they'd be willing to share as well.
Or we can
Yeah.
disseminate that to our registered attendees. That'd be great. Before we go to other questions, Gina, I had one question. Dr. Siddiq, in your sort of suggested things that guideline developers can do now, one of the bullets, I was drawn to one of the bullets that said critical appraisal with an equity lens. And, you know, that is critical appraisal is sort of so much of the work we do as guideline developers. We critically appraise the literature before, as part of our systematic review, before we compose our recommendations. I guess, can you give a more practical definition of that, so that it seems like that's something we could do right away without some big organizational reform where we're coming from?
And actually, Dr. Siddiq, there's another question that ties into that point,
Perfect.
and that is, could you provide an example of a PICO question that includes equity outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for both of those questions. So for the first question, I will say that this is a little bit more of the ongoing work, which is in this slide about, really thinking about, so different types of study designs. Obviously, our critical appraisal tool will vary based on the study design. And so each type of study, depending on the methods, can have different potential for equity issues. And so currently we've been working on, are there ways that we can add to existing critical appraisal tools and try to ask very specific questions that, based on study design, whether it's randomized studies, non-randomized studies, prediction models, these types of things. And with the highlight really being on prediction models, given EGFR, we know that there was this black correction that was being utilized, and clearly guidelines were also perpetuating the use of EGFR by telling people to use it. So as we're starting to write this guideline, we need to think, well, does this make sense? Why is there a black correction here? And that's why there need to be multiple steps throughout the process. Just because there's an evidence base that's inherently flawed, we don't need to perpetuate that as clinical guideline developers. And so I will say that this idea seems to be pretty easy in terms of some specific questions you could be asking, like, why is race being used? Is it being used as a proxy for a biological construct? And being able to, in theory, downgrade the risk of bias assessment for that, or to say there's higher risk of bias for those studies. But I think the practical reality of how we actually do this in a systemized and standardized way is something that's still being developed. And definitely, as we start to have more tools out there, we'd love to share that in upcoming webinars. For the second question about PICO questions, there have been a lot of situations in which we will take the original PICO question, just looking at the effectiveness of an intervention or a therapy, for example. And then as we're thinking about the primary outcome of mortality, we make sure that the secondary outcome also includes access, resource utilization, cost, other things that we know have an impact on equity. And then we make sure that we're searching for those terms when we're doing our systematic review to inform the guideline.
Thank you.
Okay, good. There are two questions here in the Q&A that I think I want to put out there together because they're somewhat related. And the first is, if we don't have guideline recommendations that are overtly based on racism, what is your advice or any help on how to really make sure there isn't something in the statements that is based on racism? And another person asked is that, given that equity issues are so embedded in the evidence ecosystem, should we avoid the formulation of strong recommendations and rather work with the panelists in favoring the development of conditional recommendations?
I can start maybe regarding the first question, and maybe the second question I didn't quite understand fully. So but I'm happy to address it if I can wrap my head
Right.
around it. I think, as Shazia showed in her guideline work, is to do a look at your race-based guidelines. So most guidelines that I'm aware of, I don't know that most guidelines, at least from professional societies that I'm aware of, they don't explicitly address racism, and that's part of, I think part of the evolution of what needs to happen. But many of us have recommendations that are based on race, and I think it's important to acknowledge that race is simply a risk factor for racism. I mean, that is how race, why race is such a marker for social and health inequities, because it is through racism. So I would say, even if you don't have any recommendations that are overtly based in racism, because nobody does yet, I think it's important to look at your own set of guidelines, to look at those. What the GI societies did is look at, your race-based recommendations and say, what is underpinning these race-based recommendations? And I think another important thing to think about, and I'm hoping that this might be part of, number 2 or number 3 in the series, is but to also understand, if you have race-based recommendations, it is one thing if the race-based recommendations divert resources away from a group rather than divert resources towards a group. And so I think it's important to think about not just the underpinnings of why it's a race-based recommendation, what's driving it, but also what it does to the resource allocation. And both of those considerations are important. So, I would look at race as a proxy for racism.
And I think, Jen, also to add on, one of the, until the evidence, right, catches up to where we are now in our thinking about this, what can be done and what we're doing in our task force guidelines, and is trying to have a section that really highlights the gaps in the evidence and what's needed, or to have some contextual questions that raise, at least can continue to help researchers think about what is needed going forward in the evidence. So thinking about things like access, utilization, what's the other social drivers that may be impacting the outcome, so that those types of variables will become more included over time, so that we will eventually have the data to be able to be able to evaluate it fully, going forward. So I think right now, a lot of trial, and the other, I think, positive thing that's happening is a lot of journals and, funders like NIH are requiring better representation in these clinical trials, right, with just scientific justifications for excluding groups, as opposed to just excluding groups out of feasibility. So I mean, I think it's hopeful that we should see better representation, hopefully, in the evidence over time, that will encourage people to think about social variables instead of just adjusting for race, and including measures of racism and structural factors in evidence. And I think that will help us all over time to be able to have the evidence there to really evaluate. So I think in the meantime, while that is happening, what we can do is continue to clearly outline it in our these gaps and calling for what is needed in our recommendation guidelines so that we can continue to foster better evidence that we'll be able to consider for our guidelines.
I think, Dr. Davis, what you're saying sort of underscores that this needs to be sort of a multidisciplinary effort. There are so many layers below a clinical recommendation and a clinical practice guideline, and the work has to be done in the research community, and anyone who really has touched the evidence that leads to the clinical recommendation. I think everyone has to look within their systems or processes. And it's an ongoing issue. We don't really, and evidence is still developing to, sort of make everything a little bit easier to work with. I also think what came to mind during your comment was that it's easy to sort of look at all of our guidelines and recommendations. It's easy to identify the ones that are like EGFR, that were like the low-hanging fruit. That was easy to identify as sort of a racist recommendation, but there are maybe other recommendations that sort of appear non-racist, but we really have to be more thoughtful in our approach and more critical of the whole body of evidence supporting the clinical recommendations that may appear just fine. And it is easier for organization to sort of, do a quick assessment and say, we're good, we're done. But I think we need to take a lot of time, be more thoughtful, and look at all the layers that brought us to a specific clinical recommendation. So thank you for your comments. I think I'm just trying to identify practical things for our audience members to take home and what to look for when reviewing their own guideline portfolio and their own systematic reviews, etc. I think we have a couple more questions. One question, Gina, I'd like to highlight is the person speaking about the power. And if you are not in a power position, can you really be racist? And I think that's something for us to explore. I don't know if we can answer that here. I think this person is asking, because if you're a guideline developer, you're probably not in executive leadership of your organization. Could you still impact racist work being developed? I mean, I think we all individually have the power to impact change when we are able to identify opportunities to reverse racist work. I don't think you need to be in a power position, in a more traditional power position. I think we all have the charge and the power to do it, or to at least question things.
I think so. And I think certainly wherever you are in an opportunity to create policies, right, or to change policies, I mean, those are really powerful positions, right? Like at the USPTF, I mean, we're making recommendations for the entire US population, right? That's huge implication. It's not, like we're making a recommendation, at a very small local level that's just going to affect, a few people, right? And even that would be bad. But we're talking about something that is going to affect, a large population of people. And based off of what we say, some people may benefit and some people may not. I mean, that's why, we deliberate very carefully, as you mentioned, to come up with our recommendations, because we know that the implications of those recommendations can be huge, just like in the GI Society as well, right? Like the whole clinical practice can change and affect groups of people. I mean, that is very powerful. So anytime there's a policy that exists that is going to disproportionately affect people, that is a very powerful position, and that is where racism will show up, right? Something that becomes part of, as Dr. Lynn said, part of the structure. Once it exists, then it exists no matter who comes in leadership after that, right? If the policy doesn't get changed. And I think that's, some of the effects that we're still living under in our country, is that there are policies that still exist that keep groups separated or denies access. And until we can get those policies changed, they will still exist. It doesn't matter, who comes in and out, because the policy is quote unquote still on the books. And that's why racism is in a lot of its structure, still exists today, from hundreds of years ago when it was first established.
Yeah, I also want to circle back on, the question about, people who are not considered to have power cannot be racist. I think, we've all honed in that we believe that all of you are in positions of power, but I think just in terms of the terminology, I think that is also true. And one of the problems is that everyone goes around using the term racist very freely. And Dr. Davis, I know you've spoken about this before. And so I do think it is helpful just to clarify that yes, that is correct. Your question is correct, that if you are not in a position of power, and of course we can have different definitions of what that means to be in a position of power, but if you're not in a position of power, then your behavior may be related to prejudice or discrimination, but is not in itself racist because you don't have the ability to oppress a group of people.
There are a couple other interesting questions here. One is about, given that race is a social construct, the need for diverse race representation in research is a social one. And it's not about, so the question is it not about understanding the underlying human biology of the research questions asked? I'm not 100% sure what the person is trying to ask, but I think that if it's related to whether or not the guideline should be based purely just on seeing race as a social construct versus consideration of underlying human biology, I would say that even though the underlying human biology may be similar for each person, the development of a disease can differ based on race factors in each individual. And so I think that's important for us to have representation in the research itself.
Yeah, and I apologize. Oh, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. I'll follow after.
I was just looking at the question, trying to, so a couple thoughts, and I don't know if this really gets at what's being asked, but hopefully it helps a little bit. So race is a social construct, 100%. Diverse participants in primary research is critical, absolutely. Is it a social problem? I think it's a systems problem. We can fix that. I will say that even given, especially when we look at clinical trials, I think it's imperative that we get more diverse representative populations in clinical research and clinical trials and pragmatic trials. But I will say that it is often difficult to get enough folks in that is, for having meaningful kind of subgroup analyses and that kind of stuff. So, it's important, but it's not the only fix. I think that there's a question about understanding human biology. I just want to be clear that the whole reason we're in this predicament and we see such gross health inequities is because race is a social risk factor for different biological consequences. And so I think it's really important not to dismiss that there are differences that we are seeing. This is where people get very hung up on, if race isn't a biological construct, then why do we see all these differences even when we try to adjust for everything? And I want to go back to this concept of allostatic load. We see different biology. We see, maybe modified through like epigenetics. We see different biological consequences in people of different races because, you know, there are likely physiologic stressors and sequelae that result in that. So I don't want to remove sort of biology from the discussion. I think this is where it gets a little bit, you know, you have to be careful with your language. I think what's important to understand is there's not heritable differences, there's not genetic underpinnings to race, but we can't, I don't, you know, we don't want to just remove the concept of biological differences or I would say outcomes from the discussion. So I might have muddied the water a little bit, but I just, this is such a, such a difficult area to discuss. And I think this is where a lot of even smart people get hung up. And this is where a lot of I would say people who aren't fully on board with race as a social construct really use these examples. Well, we see a more aggressive tumor biology, you know, and Black and brown people, you know, what is that, you know? So I think it's really important to understand that. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there. And I'm sorry if I muddied the issue, but I don't want to remove biology from the conversation.
If I can add on to that, I'll just say that I think there is, you know, two different ways to think about this. One is exactly what Dr. Lin just said, which is that, you know, due to the effects of systemic racism, the stress on people's body changes physiology and changes biology. So that's one. The second is, are there subgroups of people within a certain racial or ethnic group that maybe even overlap with other racial and ethnic groups that have shared genes? Of course, like we know that there's differences in prevalence of cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia that clearly trace ancestry. But the problem with the racial and ethnic groups is that it groups all people who identify as being Asian or identify as being Black with completely different ancestries and completely different genetics and completely different environmental and lifestyle factors into one group. Like these groups are just way too broad and heterogeneous, and they're really not meaningful. And as we've already discussed, they really stemmed from just a desire to oppress people. So they, like, when you look at population genomic studies, and this is why, like, we have science to back us up. Like when we sequence the you know, DNA and we sequence the human genome, we found that there are more differences within a racial and ethnic and within a racial group than amongst them. And so that really shows that, like, we know it's not a biologic construct. Lots of societies, the genomic societies, and everyone has come out to say this. And that's why, you know, believing that everybody in a certain racial category, like that it's impossible for, you know, a Black person to have cystic fibrosis, that is factually inaccurate, right? Or it's impossible for a white person to have sickle cell anemia. That's also factually inaccurate. And then also, you know, when we start to talk about people who are self-identify as being of mixed racial and ethnic groups, they don't really fall into anything. And then it's like, how do we treat them? So making decisions based on a racial and ethnic group, unless we're, you know, just doesn't make sense unless we are trying to really tackle disparities that have resulted from systemic racism. And we know that those racial and ethnic groups need more resource allocation because of structural racism. So I think there are two different things. One is that, like, yes, of course, like genetics do exist, but it's just that you can't apply it to a very broad racial and ethnic group. And the second is that the way that our bodies respond to the effects of systemic racism can then impact biology and physiology.
Right. And I think that's, I'm not sure if it's the same person, it's anonymous. There's a follow-up question that is, if a study attempts to enroll a diverse population but is unsuccessful, i.e. some races decline to participate, can the study findings used to create clinical practice guidance irrespective of race? And I'll let the panelists answer that, but we see that all the time where we have to use the RCTs. They may have less than 5% persons of color enrolled, but we still use them to create our guidelines because that's the best data we have.
I mean, absolutely. We extrapolate all the time,
all
you
the
know,
time.
older people to younger people,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think the default assumption should be that yes, you can generalize unless there's a reason you feel like you shouldn't. And because race is not a biological construct, I don't think, that should be a reason to say, well, this isn't applicable to a certain group. I think it is important to understand, though, that when we try to understand the absolute effects across populations, and that is when it's really important to, even if those groups aren't well represented in clinical trials, or for that matter, non-randomized studies, is to understand what the baseline prevalence or incidence of disease and outcomes and morbidity and suffering is in a group, because that can change your recommendation. So an example is, you know that a certain intervention can, a certain intervention can reduce a bad outcome by 30%, and it's 10 times, the bad outcome is 10 times higher in in a certain group. Well, then you might say, well, gosh, it would be more, it would be a stronger recommendation, at least in task force parlance, because there's a greater magnitude of benefit in this population. So I think that you can, you do need external data to your included studies often, but it shouldn't be, it should be a reason to sort of like confirm your findings, or to understand the absolute effects in certain populations that aren't well represented. But I don't think the default assumption should not be it's not applicable to someone unless they're represented in those trials. You have to have a reason that it's not applicable to them. But I'll like to hear what Dr. Davis and Dr. Sadiq think.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add on to that, in that I think what we miss out on when we're not, when we don't have diverse groups in clinical trials is, just what we've been talking about, what comes along with that person, right? And there are, all of the other things that we don't tend to measure, which is, so things like their access, their diet, their, physical activity, their home, the environment, all the other things that affects that person that may affect why a person will benefit from a particular screening recommendation or not. And to be able to have a broad group of people in the trials so that we understand, kind of those aspects of it, the broader variation of what people are bringing in terms of their social drivers to the trial, to be able to see in that population, how does the screening, let's say the screening with this, the screening works or doesn't work, I think is important, as opposed to having, more homogeneous trials where, say, the shared cultural experience is the same. Then we're going to miss out on understanding that piece of it. And oftentimes, we think about, if the trial is limited in to a particular group, but we see a benefit, we do, as Jen said, extrapolate. But we also know that sometimes not having those, those other contextual questions that would help us understand the benefit better, we have to think about, what other things would need to be in place in order for this particular group to actually benefit from the screening, right? And things like, things that address access or utilization or cost, or some of these other things that go along with it.
Dr. Lin, would you like to take the question regarding data on disabilities? Did you highlight that?
Oh,
one?
yeah, I was just
Yes.
I wanted to say, I think when we talk about health equity more broadly, absolutely, ableism, and people with disabilities, or, functional limitations, I think is a really critical issue and a population to be studied. I want to be clear that we really, for this seminar and this series, we really wanted to focus on race and specifically racism. And so a lot of our comments, or all of our comments, are very centric to that. Some of what we're saying absolutely is more broadly applicable, but this was a very intentional dedication of this series to race and racism, and it's not to the exclusion of other important issues. So yes, was not meant to cover all of health equity, which would have been a very tall order.
Dr. Lin, I think you had also indicated that you might attempt to answer the question whether or not, if a clinical recommendation sort of doesn't take into consideration the race aspect, should it be downgraded from strong to conditional?
Yeah, I know that people have such valuable time, and so I want to try to address, and if they're attending, I just want to try to address all the questions. So I think when it was first asked, it didn't really understand it. So it says, given health equities are so embedded in the evidence ecosystem, should we avoid the formulation of strong recommendations applicable to everyone, rather work with the panelists on favoring development of conditional recommendations? So this really touches on sort of that conversation we just had on, can you generalize the recommendation to everyone? I absolutely do not think that we need to start downgrading our recommendations, and in fact, the way a lot of health systems, like the one I work for, and others, the way we implement strong recommendations versus conditional recommendations is also really important. So we don't want to undercut the existing evidence base that is there, but I think what we're all calling for is to understand what some of the limitations of our evidence base are, to be conscious of why we're extrapolating, what we're not extrapolating, what additional information we might need, whether it's on baseline prevalence or contextual issues that Dr. Davis was talking about, and Dr. Sadiq was talking about, around availability, resources, cost implications, that sort of thing. So really, what is the totality of information that we need? And then I would also advocate for really understanding when we are seeing differences by race and ethnicity specifically, really trying to understand the mechanisms that are leading to those differences by race and ethnicity, rather than just describing it to sort of these crude and complex social categorizations. So, I don't think it's sort of downweighting. Downweighting is not from strong to conditional. I don't think is part of the solution.
I'll just add that we've had similar conversations, and so I do appreciate the question, because I think we're all trying to think about how to tackle this issue, and the question is, could this be a way to do it, just to show limitations in the evidence base? But I think our consensus has really been, like Dr. Lin said, keep the recommendation as strong, and really keep that comment or the implementation considerations section, and really talk about those evidence gaps, like how Dr. Davis did, so that we can be really clear and explicit about what we know and what we don't know, and if there are things that we hypothesize to be different amongst different or racial and ethnic groups for whatever reason, because of structural racism, et cetera, just to clearly outline that.
Thank you. Actually, Dr. Sadiq, if any of our attendees are at the GIN annual conference recently, they had a health journalist who sort of gave his assessment on how we have communicated during COVID, how we have conducted health communications during COVID. And one of the things he, as a layperson, he underscored was how important it is for medical professionals to identify when they don't have the answer, and how important it is for our community to say, we don't know this wasn't addressed in what we reviewed. So I think that really aligns with what you just said. We have to be very explicit about how much of the evidence incorporated, who the research incorporated, who's the population represented in this recommendation, and what we don't know leading up to this recommendation. So I think it really behooves all of us as guideline developers to just be a little bit more hyper aware, but also very explicit when we're reporting and when we're devising or composing recommendations. So Gina, I don't think there are other questions, correct?
No, they're not. Thank you, everyone. Some also regarding training, someone mentioned right to be a bystander. I'm not familiar with that, but just want to mention it as it was stated in the chat as a possible training on equity.
Sure, if they can email us at Gin North America
Right.
and we can make that
Yes.
available to others if they have immediate contacts with that program. So we're almost at the end of our time. Once again, I really, really want to express Gin North America's appreciation of your time, Drs. Davis, Sadiq, and Lynn. I mean, way more than your time, your expertise, your experiences with this topic, your knowledge, your research, your intimate engagement with this work. As a guideline developer, I feel sort of empowered with knowledge that I didn't have before coming to this webinar, and I hope that is a sentiment shared by our attendees. And I think there's just so much more to learn in this space, so much more to learn from each other, from the experts such as yourself, also from those working with the knowledge and content you're developing. So I think there's this ongoing work, this is a dynamic field, and we all have to sort of own our part in it and sort of have those uncomfortable discussions with each other in small settings and large settings, and really not shy away from acknowledging how we contribute to the problem and really empowering ourselves and being advocates for the solutions to these problems when they become more available, when they become more evidence-based. But we can take small steps in the interim and do our part. So I hope you are able to join us for the next installment of this series early in 2023. Hopefully by then, some of the research discussed today will be published and we could have more specific examples to discuss with our community and more specific or practical ways for guideline developers to proceed with their work in a more conscious manner of this problem. So thank you again so much for joining us. The recording and slides will be available on the GIN website. This will be communicated to you through the GIN Connect emails that you've been receiving. And our webinars are open to non-GIN members as well, but we encourage you to join GIM and to participate in our ongoing discussions on this and other important topics. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Drs. Davis, Sadiq, and Lynn, and thank you, Dina, for being so helpful today and leading up to this event.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
everyone.
everyone. Have a wonderful day.